The hospital doors closed while she was still bleeding. Ruth Carter learned that day that pain is louder when no one believes you deserve help. As she walked into the hospital alone, they called her a sinner. Abandoned by everyone. But what happened next? Before we dive in, follow us. You don't want to miss this miracle unfold. She pressed one hand against her swollen belly, the other against the wall, breathing through the pain the way she had seen other women do on television. Sweat ran down her spine. Her dress clung to her thighs. A contraction seized her so hard she gasped out loud. "Help," she said. The word floated into the hallway and died there. People looked at her, then looked away. A nurse passed, eyes flicking to Ruth's stomach, then to her face. Recognition hardened her expression. That's her. Ruth had heard the whispers for months. She's not married. Another woman's husband did that to her. Harlot. God don't bless sin. They said it inside church walls. They said it in grocery stores. They said it while quoting scripture and holding hands in prayer circles that never included her. Ruth took another step. Pain split through her again, sharper now, deeper. Her knees buckled and she caught herself on the reception desk. "I'm in labor," she said, her voice shaking. "Please." The woman behind the desk didn't stand. She didn't reach out. She scanned Ruth from head to toe, slow and deliberate, like someone inspecting a stain. "Do you have insurance?" "No," Ruth whispered. "But I work. I can pay later. Please, my baby." The woman's lips tightened. "We don't take walk-ins like this." Another contraction came, fierce and unstoppable. Ruth cried out, fingers digging into the edge of the counter. A doctor stood a few feet away, arms crossed. He glanced at her chart, then away. "You should have thought about this before you opened your legs," someone muttered. Laughter, low, uncomfortable, rippled through the room. Ruth felt something break inside her, quieter than the pain but deeper. Shame wrapped around her like a second skin. "Please," she cried, tears spilling freely now. "I'm begging." No one moved. A security guard stepped forward, already annoyed. "You can't be causing a scene in here." She stared at him in disbelief. Blood had begun to run down her legs, warm and terrifying. "I'm having a baby," she said. He looked at her belly, then at the blood, then away. "You need to leave." The doors opened again. The same cold air rushed in. The same hospital swallowed its mercy whole. Ruth stumbled outside, the sounds of the city crashing back over her. Cars, voices, church bells ringing nearby, calling the faithful to prayer. She walked. Every step was agony. Her breath came in broken gasps. Her vision blurred. People passed her on the sidewalk, stepping around her like she was something spilled. "No one touch her," someone said. "That's God's judgment." She did this to herself. She tried to keep going. She told herself if she could just make it farther, someone would help. Somewhere had to be kinder than this. But her body had reached its limit. The road thinned into dirt. Trees closed in around her, quiet and indifferent. The world tilted, spun, and Ruth collapsed onto the forest floor with a cry that ripped from her chest. Pain overtook everything. She screamed. And then, hands. Strong hands. They held her legs apart, steady, sure. Not rushed. Not afraid. Ruth's eyes flew open. There was no one there. Yet the hands were real. A calm filled her, not the absence of pain but the presence of something greater. Her breathing slowed. Her fear loosened its grip. Push. The instruction wasn't spoken, but it was clear. She pushed. Her scream echoed through the trees. The pain peaked, broke, surged again. Then a sound cut through it all. A cry. "Hi. Alive. Beautiful. Her baby." Ruth sobbed as the child was placed against her chest. His skin was warm, his tiny body trembling with life. She laughed through tears, her whole body shaking now, not from pain but relief. She tore the hem of her dress with trembling hands, wrapped him close, pressed her lips to his forehead. "Thank you," she whispered over and over. "Thank you, God." They had told her God had left her. That he didn't come near women like her. But he had come. Here. In the forest. With no witnesses. Ruth smiled through her tears, lifting her son slightly as the morning light filtered through the trees. "I declare you to God," she said softly. "Even if the world rejects you." The baby quieted, his fingers curling around her own. And in that moment, unseen, unwanted, unnamed, A destiny was born that the world would try very hard to destroy. Morning found Ruth sitting on a broken bench behind a closed laundromat, her baby bundled against her chest. He rooted weakly, mouth opening and closing, searching for something she could not give. Ruth tried anyway. She pressed him to her breast, whispered encouragement, prayed under her breath. Nothing came. Her body was empty in ways she hadn't known were possible. "I know," she murmured to him, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I'm trying." The baby cried, thin, hungry, alive. Ruth wrapped him tighter and stood. She needed help. Someone. The hospital loomed a block away, white and clean and unforgiving. As she approached, she saw the crowd. People gathered near the entrance, dressed in black and navy, Bibles tucked under arms, voices low but urgent. A pastor stood near the steps, his hand resting on a woman's shoulder as she sobbed into his chest. She was a woman of faith, someone said. Never missed a service. God knows best. Ruth slowed. He recognized them. Church members. The same faces that had looked through her yesterday. The same mouths that had spoken her name like a curse. She turned her face away and tried to pass unnoticed. Then someone gasped. "That's her." Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A woman stepped closer, eyes fixed on the bundle in Ruth's arms. "Is that a baby?" Ruth said nothing. "How did she give birth?" another voice asked. "She was bleeding all over the place yesterday." A man frowned. "Ain't that something?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd, confusion mixing with something sharper, resentment. She lived. After all that? God spared her. Ruth's arms tightened around her child. Someone laughed, brittle and ugly. "So God lets a harlot deliver safely, but takes the baby of a pastor's wife?" The crying woman near the steps looked up then. Her eyes were red, hollow. She stared at Ruth like she was seeing a ghost. 5 pregnancies, Ruth heard someone whisper. 5 losses. The pastor's voice rose, strained but practiced. "We don't question the Lord." But they did. Ruth could hear it in the way their words twisted. How does that make sense? What kind of God does that? She didn't even suffer. This is an insult to faith. Ruth wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them about the floor of the forest, the blood, the terror, the hand she couldn't see. She wanted to ask why holiness had become a measure of worth, why grace came with conditions. But she said nothing. She lowered her head and walked. Behind her, the crowd continued, mourning one child while condemning another for breathing. Ruth reached the edge of the hospital grounds and stopped. Her baby stirred, his cry breaking her heart again. She looked down at him, this small, impossible thing. "They're angry at God," she whispered. "But they're punishing us." The church bells rang again, loud, confident, certain. Ruth walked away from them, carrying the proof of a mercy no one wanted to believe in. The woman found Ruth at dusk. Not in the open. Not where anyone could see. She came quietly, like a thought Ruth had been trying not to think. Her name was Evelyn Brooks, and grief had carved her face into something sharp and tired. Her eyes moved first to the baby, then away as if looking too long might break her. "You shouldn't be out here," she said softly. "People are talking." Ruth said nothing. She had learned that silence was safer. Evelyn took a breath. "My daughter buried her 5th child this morning." Ruth felt the words land inside her like stones. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Evelyn nodded, but there was no comfort in it. Only resolve. "She's a good woman," Evelyn said. "Faithful. Obedient. She's done everything right." The baby stirred in Ruth's arms. Evelyn stepped closer. "And you don't have anyone." It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. "I can help you," Evelyn continued. "I can give you money. Enough to start over. Somewhere far from here. You won't have to scrub floors or beg strangers." Ruth looked up then. Her heart began to race. "For what?" she asked, though she already knew. Evelyn swallowed. "The child." The world narrowed. Ruth's arms tightened instinctively, her body bending protectively over her son. "No." Evelyn didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. Thick, heavy. It bent under its own weight. "My daughter will raise him like her own," she said. "He'll have a home. A name. Doctors. Schools. Church. You'll disappear," Evelyn added gently. And no one will ever judge you again. The silence stretched. Inside Ruth something whispered, not loud, not forceful. I will not abandon you. The words came without sound, without explanation. They didn't promise comfort. Only presence. Ruth closed her eyes. What if, another thought crept in, slick, convincing, what if that's what God means? What if this money is the way out? What if faith is just waiting for opportunity? Her hands trembled. She pictured the long nights ahead. The hunger. The looks. The closed doors. The baby crying while her body failed him again. I can't raise him, she said, her voice breaking. I don't even have milk. Evelyn nodded quickly. Then let someone who can do it. The envelope was pressed into Ruth's hand. Felt like safety. Felt like betrayal. Something deep inside her twisted, sharp, final. She knew it then. This was the worst decision of her life. But desperation is louder than wisdom. Ruth looked at her son one last time, memorizing his face like it might be taken from memory too. I just need a chance, she whispered. Evelyn reached for the baby. The silent voice did not leave. But Ruth did. The room was too clean for what was about to happen. A small office near the edge of town. Beige walls. A humming air conditioner. A table polished so often it had lost its warmth. On the wall hung a framed verse about blessings that Ruth could not bring herself to read. The baby slept in her arms. He was warm. He smelled like milk he hadn't had enough of, like skin that still remembered where it came from. Ruth traced his cheek with her finger, slow, deliberate, etching him into herself. Evelyn Brooks sat across from her, hands folded. Calm. Prepared. This is the best thing, she said, not looking directly at Ruth. You know that. Ruth nodded because nodding was easier than speaking. A man in a gray suit slid papers across the table. He didn't explain much. He didn't need to. His pen tapped once, twice. Sign here. Ruth hesitated. The room felt heavy, like something sacred was being dismantled piece by piece. Inside her the quiet voice returned, not pleading, not condemning. I'm still here. But the other voice, the one that promised relief, escape, rest, rose louder. This is mercy, it said. This is provision. This is how you survive. Ruth picked up the pen. Her hand shook. As the ink touched paper, something inside her tore. Not violently but cleanly, the way bone breaks when it has already been weakened. She signed. Evelyn stood. She reached for the baby, her movements careful, rehearsed. Ruth's body reacted before her mind did, arms tightening, breath catching. For a moment neither woman moved. I love him, Ruth whispered. Evelyn nodded. So do we. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the truth Ruth needed. She kissed her son's forehead once. Then again. Her tears fell onto his skin, soaking into him like a final baptism. I wanted better for you, she said. I wanted to stay. The baby stirred, made a small sound, and then he was gone from her arms. Just like that. Evelyn wrapped him in a soft blanket. She held him with the practiced ease of someone who expected him to belong there. Outside a car waited. Ruth did not follow. She walked away alone, the envelope heavy in her pocket, her arms aching with the memory of weight they would never hold again. Behind closed doors the lie was perfected. Evelyn dressed in black and told the world the miracle baby had survived. Papers were filed. Names were changed. The law nodded in agreement. The boy became theirs. And Ruth Carter became a woman who once had a child. America calls this opportunity. Calls it a second chance. But somewhere between comfort and survival, a future was traded for relief, and no one would ever call it theft. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peace. It was cold, still, and judgmental, like a frozen stare that could pierce the flesh. Chris, Ruth's son now in another name, another life, lay in his small crib in the corner of the grand room. The nursery smelled of disinfectant and polished wood, not warmth. The lights flickered softly, highlighting the contrast, the comfort of the furniture against the chill of the hearts surrounding him. The pastor, his new father, stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. Every time Chris stirred or made a small sound, the man's lips pressed tighter. His faith, once wide and booming, now hummed with suspicion and envy. He questioned God silently every day. Why him? Why this child? A sinner's son surviving when my wife loses her own? Chris sensed it before he even understood it. The weight of their resentment clung to him like a shadow. Meals were given, clothes were changed, bedtime was enforced. But never with warmth, never with attention. The household did just enough to keep him alive. The love he craved, the touch he longed for, was doled out in scarce crumbs. The pastor's wife, meanwhile, watched the child with narrowed eyes. She envied him for the life he had survived, the small, miraculous heartbeat she could never hear in her own dead children. Every smile he gave, every cry, every gasp of breath that meant he lived, reminded her of what she had lost. It was an invisible knife she kept to herself, but it cut as deep as if she had thrown it. The only person who softened toward him was Evelyn, the old woman who had orchestrated his survival. She knew the game being played, the theater of appearances and lies. She had dressed him in the finest clothes, ensured his papers were flawless, and whispered to him in quiet moments, "You belong here, little one, but your heart belongs higher." Chris learned quickly. He learned to obey, to kneel in the pews, to smile at the people who ignored him. He absorbed the discipline and the avoidance. Every ounce of rejection taught him to move silently, to anticipate anger before it arrived, to protect the fragile part of himself that still believed in God. And he did believe. Not in the hypocritical smiles, not in the judgment he saw every day, but in the God that Ruth had spoken of, the one who had saved him in the forest, the one who had placed invisible hands around him before anyone else cared. Months passed. The household changed. The pastor's wife delivered twins, this time healthy and loud. Wealth seemed to increase mysteriously, better investments, luck in business, a sudden ease in their lives. Everyone noticed, whispered. But no one dared speak the truth. It was Chris, the unwanted child who had carried a spark of life too strong to be ignored. And still, Chris remained devoted, quietly, humbly. He had no illusions about their hearts, no expectation of warmth, only the steadfast love of the old woman and the invisible God above. He lived in the house, but he didn't belong to it. He belonged to a purpose larger than their greed, envy, and judgment. And in that quiet understanding, the boy began to grow, not just in body but in spirit, learning to survive in the cold while carrying fire in his chest. Chris could feel it even before he understood the words for it. A warmth inside him that pulsed differently from the cold walls of the house. It came in quiet moments, when he prayed silently at the foot of the bed, when he walked alone in the garden, when the city noises fell away in the evening. God was there, present, watching, holding. But no one else seemed to notice. His father, the pastor, the man who preached fire and mercy, watched him sometimes. He saw the boy alive, moving, breathing, but all he saw was a reminder of failure. Why him? Why not my children? Chris could feel the glances, the resentment pressing on him, like chains he didn't yet know how to break. His mother, the woman who had birthed twins and finally felt life settle in her favor, was different. She smiled at him sometimes, even touched his shoulder once or twice, whispering encouragement he didn't fully understand. But it was not warmth. It was calculation, soft and careful, meant to shape him into something disposable, to ensure he survived just enough to validate the household, never enough to rise above it. Chris began to wander. He learned to slip out at night, walking the streets where the air smelled of smoke and gasoline and city heat. He learned to listen to the sounds that others ignored. He tasted the bitter comfort of cigarettes, the sharp rush of smoke in his lungs. It was the first thing that made him feel free in the world he was born into. A world that wanted him alive but not thriving. School became a battlefield. Late arrivals, skipped classes, a uniform wrinkled and forgotten. Every scolding from his father felt hollow. The words didn't teach him anything. They only reminded him that love in the house was conditional, and judgment came faster than guidance. Even in the quiet of his mother's rare moments of affection, Chris began to feel the strange twist of irony. He loved her. He clung to her small gestures. But unknowingly her love was tethered to fear, ambition, and envy. An invisible leash meant to contain the fire in him, to prevent him from becoming more than she could control. Yet God remained. Chris prayed in secret. He prayed with all the desperation of a child who had been abandoned in spirit, if not in body. The warmth he felt, the quiet reassurance, whispered that there was more for him than this house, more than the judgmental glances, the cold words, the stolen attention. But in the meantime he fell. Small things at first, smoke, minor theft, skipping school. Each misstep was unnoticed or dismissed. His father corrected him only to shrug it off, as if rebellion was inevitable and irrelevant. Each evening, Chris returned home, guilt gnawing at him, yet no one noticed the battles inside him. Tragic irony wrapped him like a cloak. The child born to survive miracles connected to God from birth, was being trained by the very world around him to fail, to stumble, to drift, without guidance, without nurture, without anyone recognizing the treasure they held. Chris's eyes often wandered to the sky at night, thinking maybe God understood him better than anyone else ever could. And in those moments, despite the neglect, despite the coldness, he held on to a fragile spark, one that the house around him could neither touch nor extinguish. Chris moved through the city like a shadow. The night streets smelled of gasoline, smoke, and desperation. Every step he took was calculated, learned from years of survival in a house that neither nurtured nor loved him. He was 19, lean, strong, and dangerous, not by nature but by necessity. His mother had told him once, almost casually, "You're a man now. You need to fend for yourself." The words had cut deeper than any slap. She didn't say it with anger. She said it with relief, as if pushing him out was a mercy. Chris had understood immediately. Home was no longer home. Survival was up to him. And so he ran. He fell into the shadows of the city's underworld, working for men who smelled power and money more than loyalty. They used him for runs, errands, small thefts at first. Then bigger jobs. Packages that might contain cash, drugs, weapons. He learned quickly. In the streets, mistakes were punished with blood, and survival demanded speed, cunning, and silence. It was in a club one night, loud and pulsating with neon lights and heavy music, that the real trap appeared. Her name was Layla. She wanted him, not for money, not for power, but for herself. She whispered in his ear, pressed against him, promised a world he'd never known. Her boyfriend was a ruthless, high-ranking Mafia enforcer, a man known for blood and precision. But Layla didn't care. She led him into a cramped bathroom, closed the door, and gave herself to him with a boldness that made him dizzy. In that moment, Chris felt alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. Wanted, not judged, not used. But life has a way of balancing the scales. Someone had seen. Someone had reported. And the Mafia, never patient, never forgiving, never thorough in their questioning, pieced together a story. Chris woke the next morning to sirens. He didn't know it yet, but Layla's boyfriend had been found murdered. The evidence, traces of Chris's fingerprints, his DNA from the night before, eyewitness misdirection, was stacked like a mountain against him. Chris ran. Through alleyways, under bridges, past abandoned warehouses and neon-lit diners. Every step felt like fire on his heels. The law, the Mafia, the shadows, they all became one terrifying thing. No one asked questions. No one cared to see the truth. He was guilty until proven innocent, and in this city, proof didn't matter. By the time he reached the river, chest heaving, lungs burning, the weight of betrayal pressed down on him. The girl he had loved in that reckless moment didn't deny what had happened. She didn't claim him either. She let the accusation stand, silent, untouchable, leaving him alone in the storm. Chris vanished that night. No address, no calls, no traces. He became a ghost in the city's underbelly. The streets had claimed him, the law hunted him, the Mafia wanted him dead, or worse. Survival became instinct, prayer became a whisper, and trust became a memory. And somewhere deep inside he wondered, did God still see him? Chris ran until the city became a blur. No streetlights, no friends, no home. Only the hum of neon signs, the hiss of steam from subway vents, the distant sirens that never slept. His parents' last words echoed in his mind, "Run for your life. Never come back." Relief and warning wrapped in the same sentence, spoken with their version of love. But love had never been his gift. Only survival. He slept where he could, ate what he could steal or beg, and learned quickly that safety was a lie. Trust was a myth. The world was louder than prayer, darker than faith. And yet, God was still there. Not in warmth, not in comfort, but in flickers. Moments of clarity in the haze of his ruined nights. Sometimes he'd close his eyes, remember the hands in the forest, remember his mother's whispered promise of "I will not abandon you," and feel a small pulse of something unbroken. But the streets offered their own seduction. Cigarettes, cheap liquor, pills that promised numbness, ecstasy, forgetfulness. Each indulgence was a bandage over old wounds he couldn't face, over the loneliness of being born into a world that rejected him. Sex became another escape. Women and men, fleeting warmth, empty beds, brief intimacy that filled nothing but the hollow inside him. Each encounter reminded him of what he had lost and what no one had nurtured in him. Guidance, care, protection. Prayer was no longer easy. Words felt foreign, like his tongue had forgotten them. He always tried, but fear and shame twisted every syllable. Sometimes he cried in the dark, whispering broken sentences, asking for help he didn't know how to receive. And still danger hunted him. Mafia grudges lingered, cops looked for the wrong evidence, old debts whispered in his ear. Every step outside was a risk. Every stranger could be a threat. Every decision carried the weight of life or death. Chris was alone. And in that loneliness he began to understand the cruelest truth. America had abandoned its gifted poor, left them to survive or die, forced to navigate a world of injustice, deceit, and betrayal. The world had wanted him alive but not thriving. It had wanted him contained, broken, useful only in ways it could tolerate. And yet, despite the drugs, despite the sins, despite the nights that seemed endless and merciless, he kept a thread of himself intact. A spark, stubborn and quiet, that remembered God, remembered survival, remembered hope. Exiled, hunted, addicted, and scarred, Chris was losing everything. But not yet. Not yet. The apartment was small, barely enough space for a cot, a folding table, and the stack of unwashed clothes that smelled faintly of smoke and cheap alcohol. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a pale yellow glow that made shadows crawl across the cracked walls. Chris dropped onto the cot, exhausted but restless. He had been thinking about God again, not the distant, judgmental God of his childhood, but the one that sometimes answered quietly when he humbled himself. He had learned slowly that his prayers worked only if he asked without judging, without expecting, without anger. This morning was no exception. He had been careless last night, leaving his phone in a narrow, crowded house where he had slept with several women, sharing warmth that was more transactional than intimate. The phone was important, not just as a connection to the outside but as a lifeline, a thread tying him to the remnants of his sanity. When he got there, the house reeked of perfume and cigarette smoke. Narrow hallways squeezed him, walls painted in peeling pink and gold, and the floor sticky from unknown liquids. He navigated carefully, hoping no one would notice him. A small boy darted toward him, hand outstretched, eyes pleading. "Money," the boy said quickly, frantically, his voice almost inaudible over the hum of activity. Chris smiled faintly and reached into his back pocket, pulling out the few bills he had. He handed them to the boy. The boy hesitated, then snatched them, but something felt wrong. Chris fumbled to reach for more change, and that's when he realized. His wallet, the one in his front pocket, was gone. The boy, small, scrappy, clever, had already taken it. Chris froze for a second, then shook his head with a wry smile. "Even a street kid can outsmart me." He stopped suddenly. The wallet was gone. Chris's stomach sank. No, not now. He had helped the boy earlier. The deaf kid who ran into him, desperate, fumbling for money. Chris had handed him the extra cash he had in his pocket, not thinking twice. He hadn't noticed the smaller, sleeker theft. His wallet had vanished. He tried to pay the women who had his phone, shoving the little cash he had left. They haggled, demanded more, but finally handed it over. Chris exhaled, relief almost making him stumble. He turned toward the street, thinking of home, of some safe corner where he could breathe. Then he saw them. 2 police officers, their jackets dark against the streetlights, standing over a woman whose bag had just been ripped from her car. The air grew heavier, tighter. His pulse spiked. And then a shout. "That's the deaf boy." Chris froze. The voice was sharp, accusing. Eyes turned to him. The woman was pointing. People started murmuring. Instinct took over. The deaf boy ran straight for him. Not away, not hiding, but like he trusted Chris. Like he knew this man was the only safety he had. Chris's chest tightened. He's only a kid. Only a kid. The police hesitated, confused. The bag-snatching woman screamed again, pointing at Chris, accusing him of aiding the boy. The alley became a blur of shouts, footsteps, and panic. Then a voice sliced through the air. "That's him," a woman shouted, pointing. "That's the boy who took the bag." The crowd leaned in. Chris looked up slowly. "No," he said. "He didn't." "He's deaf," the woman added quickly. "He can't hear you anyway." The boy froze. His grip on Chris tightened. His breathing stopped. And then clear, loud, terrified, he spoke. "That's a lie," the boy cried. "I can hear." The street went silent. Even the police stiffened. Murmurs spread like fire. People turned toward the woman. Her confidence wavered. Faces changed. Doubt crept in. The officers exchanged glances. When the crowd thinned and the noise softened, Chris pulled the boy aside, kneeling so they were eye to eye. His voice was low, steady, nothing like the chaos around them. "Listen to me," Chris said gently. "Running like that will get you killed one day." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "Where are your parents?" Chris asked. "Who do you live with?" The boy shook his head, sobbing now. Chris felt something twist deep inside him, a familiar ache. A future he recognized too well. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, firm but kind. "You don't belong in this street," he said. "And neither did I." The police watched from a distance, unsure what to do next. The woman had already backed away, her accusation dissolving under scrutiny. Chris stood slowly, keeping the boy close. His name echoed in his own mind then. Not the one the streets had given him, not the one written on false charges and police files. Chris. For the first time in a long time, the name felt clean. In that moment, surrounded by noise and danger, he realized something terrifying and holy at once. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was protecting. The boy stood there, unmoving. Chris had finished speaking, his words still hanging in the air between them. Advice. Warning. Care. Things no one had ever said to him when he was that small. But the boy wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were wide, too wide. His mouth slightly open, as if he had just heard something that broke the rules of the world. "Did you hear me?" Chris asked, softer now. The boy nodded slowly. Then he shook his head. Then he whispered, barely audible, I can hear." The words didn't land where they should have. Chris only heard fear in them, confusion. He thought the boy was in shock from almost being arrested, from being accused, from the chaos of the street. "Calm down," Chris said gently. "You're safe now." But the boy stepped backward. His hands began to tremble. He pressed his palms over his ears, then pulled them away, testing the air, listening to footsteps, car engines, distant voices, sounds he had never owned before. Everything was too loud. Too alive. Chris took a step forward, but the boy flinched as if he were standing before something dangerous. Not a man, but a mystery. "No," the boy whispered again. This wasn't like this before." Chris frowned. What wasn't? The boy's chest rose and fell fast. Tears spilled down his face, not from fear this time, but from disbelief so sharp it hurt. Then he ran. Straight down the street. Fast. Desperate. As if the ground might disappear beneath him if he stopped. "Hey!" Chris called after him. "Wait." But the boy didn't look back. Chris stood there alone, confused, the city noise closing in again. He shrugged it off, assuming trauma, adrenaline, anything that made sense. He had no idea. No idea that something ancient had passed through him without permission. No idea that hands once invisible had moved again. No idea that a deaf child had just heard the world for the first time. And because he did not know, he let the boy go. The miracle walked away running. They returned the next morning. The boy held his mother's hand tightly, guiding her to the same place on the street where everything had changed. She was blind, had been for years, but she trusted him without question. Her faith was quiet, unannounced, rooted in survival. Her son had never lied to her. "He will come," the boy said. So they waited. They came early every day and left only when the light began to fade. People passed them. Cars slowed and moved on. Some offered coins. Some offered pity. Most offered nothing. 9 days passed. On the 10th day, as they turned to leave, the boy suddenly stopped. Across the road, a figure walked toward them. Jacket pulled up, head lowered, moving with the tired rhythm of a man carrying too much history. "That's him," the boy whispered. Without looking, he ran. "Wait," he called. But the man turned and it wasn't him. The boy froze. Then he broke. He fell to his knees on the pavement, sobbing openly. The sound drew attention. People stared. His mother reached for him, frightened. "Hi, son," she said. "What is it?" He cried harder. "I was wrong." He pulled him close, rocking him. The story of their lives pressed in again. The boy born deaf, the father who died chasing doctors and miracles, the family that threw them out when the man was buried. homelessness, hunger, darkness. As the boy stood to cross back to his mother, he collided with someone. Hard. He looked up. It was him. Chris. Their eyes met. The boy gasped, grabbed his hand, overwhelmed, terrified he might disappear again. Chris steadied him instinctively the way he always did without knowing why. They crossed the street together. The blind woman reached out and touched Chris's arm, her fingers trembling. "This is him," the boy said through tears. "The man I told you about." Chris shook his head slowly. "I don't understand," he said. "I didn't do anything." The boy fell to his knees. "Please," he begged. "Please heal my mother's eyes. I was deaf. I heard when I touched you. I know it was you." The street quieted. People stopped. Chris stepped back, shaken. "I'm not a doctor," he said. "I don't know how to do that." The mother lifted her face toward him. Her eyes were clouded, lifeless, but her voice was steady. "Just touch me," she said. "That's all." Chris hesitated. Fear crept in, not of power but of responsibility. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said softly. "I don't know what your son thinks happened." But something moved in him, old, deep, undeniable. Not confidence. Not certainty. Surrender. He laid his hands on her face. He didn't shout. He didn't command. He didn't even know what to pray. "God," he whispered, almost embarrassed. "If this is you, then do it." The woman inhaled sharply. Her body stiffened. Then, she screamed. Not in pain. In shock. "I can see," she cried. "I can see." The crowd erupted. Phones came out. People shouted. Others fell silent, trembling. The boy clung to his mother, laughing and crying at the same time. Chris staggered backward. His hands shook. He looked at them like they belonged to someone else. The miracle stood there, breathing, seeing, alive. And for the first time the street did not see a criminal, a runaway, or a broken man. They saw something holy. And Chris ran. Chris didn't wait for the applause. He didn't stay to answer questions or explain what he couldn't explain himself. The crowd's voices blurred into noise. Too loud, too sharp, too dangerous. He ran. By the time he reached his room, his body was shaking. He locked the door, leaned against it, slid down to the floor like his legs had finally given up permission to collapse. "I don't understand," he whispered into the darkness. "I didn't ask for this." His hands were still warm. Not from the woman's face, but from something deeper, something that felt borrowed. He lay on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. His breath slowed. His heart didn't. Then it came. Not a dream. Not sleep. A weight pressed on his chest, not painful but undeniable. The room dissolved, replaced by something vast and terrifyingly clear. He saw crowds. Not cheering, crying. Hospitals overflowing. Streets lined with bodies. Faces twisted in pain, reaching toward him, calling his name like it was the last thing they had left. "Help us." He saw himself standing above them, not elevated but alone. Powerful. Untouched. And then he saw it. Men in suits. Pulpits. Microphones. Smiling mouths with jealous eyes. Hands reaching not for healing but for ownership. He saw himself moving upward, drifting toward light, not as a savior but like a dead man leaving the living behind. Below him people screamed his name. The vision shifted. He saw a younger version of himself, smoking, drinking, sleeping with strangers, trying to drown the calling in pleasure. Trying to outrun God the same way he'd outrun police and death. "If you don't surrender," the voice continued, "your gift will become your execution." Chris tried to move. He couldn't. "If you don't surrender," the voice continued, "your gift will become your execution." Chris sat up screaming. The room snapped back into place. Sweat soaked his shirt. His chest burned like he'd been underwater too long. "No," he said aloud. "I can't do this." He paced the room, rubbing his face, pulling at his hair. "I'm not holy. I'm not clean. I'm not ready." Outside, sirens wailed. Inside, something waited. Chris fell to his knees, not in surrender but in exhaustion. "Please," he whispered. "Choose someone else." The ceiling remained silent. And in that silence the tragedy took root, not because he lacked power but because he feared obedience. He had been shown the cost. And he chose to run. It started the way all modern myths do. With a phone. A shaky video. A woman screaming she could see. A boy laughing and crying at the same time. And Chris standing there stunned, looking more afraid than holy. By morning the clip was everywhere. Instagram, TikTok, WhatsApp groups, Twitter threads arguing whether it was real or staged or demonic or divine. People slowed it down frame by frame. Zoomed in on his hands. On his face. On the moment the woman opened her eyes. A young man. A street boy. A former gangster. Used by God. The comments were louder than the truth. God can use anybody. This is fake. Why him? Imagine a sinner doing the work of God. Chris didn't post anything. He didn't explain. He didn't defend himself. He stayed quiet. He had learned silence early. Learned that explaining yourself to people who already decided who you are only drains what little strength you have left. His adopted parents saw the video. The pastor watched it once. Then again. His jaw tightened. His wife said nothing, her eyes dark with something between fear and resentment. This will bring trouble, the pastor finally said. Chris didn't argue. He simply nodded. He had stopped hoping for approval from that house a long time ago. The fame didn't feel like honor. It felt like exposure. And exposure without protection is dangerous. Across town another story was unfolding. Her name was Naomi Walker and she had been barren for 12 years. Not childless. Barren. The kind of word people lower their voices to say. The kind that turns family gatherings into interrogations. The kind that makes mothers-in-law whisper about second wives. Her husband's family had started to pressure him openly now. You're still young, they said. You deserve heirs. Naomi prayed until prayer became muscle memory. She visited churches. Fasted. Sowed seeds. Joined women's groups. Cried in bathrooms. Smiled in public. Eventually she found a man of God everyone respected. He was disciplined. Known. Clean. He fasted often. His church fed the poor. His prayers worked. For others. Naomi knelt before him one afternoon, hope trembling in her chest. He prayed. He taught her faith. Commitment. Obedience. Work with God, he said. Not by sight. She obeyed. Months passed. Nothing happened. One early morning the pastor called her. You do your devotions? He asked. Yes, sir. You obey God's commandments? Yes, sir. And your husband meets with you? Yes. He paused. Then what exactly is the problem? Others have testified. Something in Naomi broke. She told him the truth she had buried for years. That when she was younger, reckless and searching, she had damaged her body. Surgeries. Complications. No womb. She wept as she spoke. The pastor was silent. Then he said, Don't trouble God anymore. The words landed like a sentence. No wonder nothing happened, he added. God is not mocked. The line went dead. Naomi collapsed onto the floor, crying until her chest hurt. But something stubborn remained alive in her. A refusal to believe that God was finished with her just because a man said so. He prayed anyway. Quietly. Alone. Every day. Meanwhile, Chris's name kept spreading. Not because he sought it. Because the world loves miracles. But not the weight that comes with them. And somewhere between the videos, the comments, the envy, and the unanswered prayers, destiny was quietly lining up another encounter. One that would push Chris further into light. And closer to the darkness watching him. 4 years, the world had not only told Naomi her situation was impossible. It had trained her to feel impossible. Doctors had said it plainly. Church people had said it politely. Time had said it cruelly. She had learned to carry her hope quietly, the way people carry something fragile that breaks if spoken too loudly. Then she saw him. Not in person. Not in church. On her phone. A young man, awkward, unsure, nothing like the men in robes she was used to seeing. The video showed a blind woman screaming that she could see. Another clip showed a boy reacting to sound for the first time in his life. No stage lights. No altar call. No offering basket. Just God, raw and uncontrolled. Naomi searched for him. She looked for a church address. A ministry page. A contact number. But there was nothing. Only reposts. Comment sections. Strangers arguing over a miracle they didn't own. So she prayed. God, she whispered every morning, if you used him then you can find me too. Weeks passed. Then one Sunday a colleague invited her to a small church on the edge of town. Nothing special. No banners. No fame. Halfway through the service the atmosphere shifted. The pastor paused, eyes narrowing like he was listening to something no one else could hear. "There's a young man here," he said slowly. "You don't like attention but God insists." Chris stood reluctantly. The room changed. The air grew heavy. People began to cry without knowing why. Someone dropped to their knees. Another screamed that pain had left their body. A woman touched the hem of Chris's jacket and collapsed whole. Naomi couldn't breathe. She didn't rush forward. She didn't shout. She surrendered. Right there in her seat she gave God everything she had left. Her shame, her past, her broken body, her anger at men who had spoken for God without knowing him. Chris prayed for her simply. No declaration. No performance. "God," he said quietly, "you see her." That month did not pass. Naomi conceived. Doctors called it medically impossible. Records were reviewed. Scans repeated. Specialists confused. 9 months later, under careful medical supervision, she gave birth to triplets. 2 boys. 1 girl. The story spread faster than the video. And somewhere, behind polished pulpits and controlled miracles, jealousy stood up and took notes. Naomi returned to church carrying evidence. Not arguments. Not explanations. 3 children. She parked her car slowly, careful with the doors, careful with her joy. As she stepped out, adjusting the carrier straps, she looked up and froze. Standing near the entrance was the man who had once told her there was no hope. The prophet. Older now. Famous still. Surrounded by people who lowered their voices around him like God himself might overhear. For a brief moment, shame crossed his face. It passed quickly. "Naomi," he said, forcing a smile. "God has done well." She bowed her head respectfully. "All glory to God, sir." She did not accuse him. She did not remind him of the phone call. Grace embarrassed him more than anger ever could. They entered together. The program was powerful. Worship shook the room. Leaders from different churches filled the front rows. Cameras hovered. The atmosphere was charged. Then Naomi was called forward. She didn't preach. She testified. She spoke softly about despair, rejection, unanswered prayers, and how God bypassed everything she thought he needed to heal her. "I didn't deserve it," she said. "But God found me anyway." The room erupted. People stood. Some wept. Others shouted praise. Chris stood near the side. No suit. No title. Just simple trousers, a t-shirt, worn shoes. His lips were darkened from years of smoking he hadn't yet fully escaped. His posture was unsure, like someone still surprised to be standing where he was. The old prophet watched him. And something twisted inside him. This boy? This is who God chose. He noticed everything, the casual clothes, the rough edges, the lack of polish. He remembered the years of fasting, discipline, reputation, and sacrifice it took him to be respected. And yet, no one was looking at him. The honor that usually followed him like a shadow had shifted. It rested on someone else. A boy with no altar. No covering. No pedigree. His smile tightened. Inside questions turned sharp. Does God reward disorder now? Has holiness become optional? The applause grew louder. The old prophet stood up slowly, nodded to no one in particular, and walked out before the program ended. Outside, the night air felt cold. He sat in his car for a long time, hands on the steering wheel, staring ahead. Jealousy did not announce itself. It disguised itself as concern, as doctrine, as righteousness. And that was when it became dangerous. The old prophet did not confront Chris publicly. He waited. He watched him stumble through fame without armor, still smoking behind buildings, still fighting old habits, still unsure whether he belonged anywhere near God's power. This one is easy, he thought. Gifted but unfinished. And unfinished things are vulnerable. When he finally approached Chris, it was gentle. "Son," he said one evening, laying a hand on his shoulder, "I see something special in you." Chris stiffened, then relaxed. No one had ever said that to him without wanting something in return. "I've been praying for you," the prophet continued. "Power like yours is dangerous without guidance." Chris nodded. He knew that was true. They began meeting privately. At first it felt like help. The prophet opened scriptures, spoke of holiness, discipline, order. He reminded Chris of his past, The smoking, the women, the drugs. Not accusing, just not forgetting. God can use anyone, he said softly. But he withdraws when vessels stay dirty. The words lodged deep. Soon correction became constant. If miracles are happening through you, the prophet asked one day, why do you still feel empty? Chris didn't answer. Because the enemy mimics God, the man said. Satan can heal too. He gives gifts quickly without repentance. Fear replaced wonder. The prophet spoke of punishment, of judgment, of men who touched holy things wrongly and died. He said Chris's visions were pride. His experiences, deception. God wouldn't bypass his servants for a boy with no altar, he said calmly. Ask yourself, why you? Chris's guilt did the rest. He began to doubt the voice that once led him. Every miracle now felt suspicious. Every prayer felt dangerous. The prophet drew closer. Not to protect him, but to replace him. Chris had been warned. Dreams. Unease. A quiet voice saying be careful. But temptation doesn't always look like sin. Sometimes it looks like mentorship. And when Chris finally handed over his confidence, his discernment, his sense of calling, the poison finished its work. The tragedy had begun. They did not kill Chris with a weapon. They killed him with words. The old prophet stood before cameras and congregations, his voice heavy with rehearsed sorrow. He spoke of concern, of burden, of love for a lost soul. He said Chris had been struggling with secret sin. That God was working on him. That exposure was mercy. And the world believed him. Chris watched it all from a distance. Screens glowing in dark rooms, headlines scrolling past his eyes like verdicts already decided. Each word peeled something off him. Each scripture quoted against him felt like a nail. You must confess, the prophet told him privately. Your suffering is proof God is correcting you. Your gift was never grace, it was patience. Chris stopped sleeping. He stopped praying. He replayed his past until it swallowed his present. Every cigarette became evidence. Every woman a sentence. Every mistake a reason God must have been done with him. He forgot the blind mother who now saw her son's face. He forgot the boy who heard laughter for the first time. He forgot the hands that once moved through him without effort. All he could hear was guilt. He fasted until his body trembled. He wept until tears stopped coming. He knelt for hours, begging a God who no longer felt near, asking forgiveness for crimes he could no longer separate from his existence. The prophet called this repentance. It was slow suicide. On the night it happened there were no miracles. No visions. No warnings. Chris was alone. His body gave out first, collapsed under the weight his soul had been carrying for years. They found him on the floor, lips dry, hands still clenched like he was holding on to something invisible. By morning the news spread. Not as tragedy, as caution. A gifted young man, they said. Too wild. Too unstable. Too unclean for the power he carried. Across the country people went quiet. The blind woman dropped her phone and screamed. The boy sat on the curb and waited, not knowing why his chest hurt. Hospitals stayed full. Prayers went unanswered. It felt like the air itself had thinned. Birds did not fly that morning. Church bells rang late. And somewhere deep in the nation's conscience, something sacred broke. America had done it again. It had mistaken holiness for polish, guidance for control, and grace for something that must be earned. They buried Chris. But what they really buried was the proof that God still moves through the broken. At first the prophet felt victorious. The crowds grew again. Invitations multiplied. His name returned to banners and programs, printed in bold the way it always had been. In private he told himself he had defended God's order. That some vessels, no matter how gifted, were too cracked to carry power. He slept well for a while. Then one Sunday morning he lifted his hands to pray and nothing followed. The words came out right. The tone was perfect. The scripture was accurate. But the room stayed still. No hush. No trembling. No presence. He blamed the people. Their faith, he said, was weak. He preached harder. Louder. He fasted longer. He called for more offerings, more vigils, more fire. So, nothing. Miracles stopped quietly, the way a river dries before anyone notices. Testimonies slowed, then disappeared. People still clapped, still shouted, still posted clips online, but the healings no longer followed the noise. He was famous, but powerless. At night, sleep abandoned him. When it came, it brought dreams he could not control. In one vision, he stood in a sanctuary filled with light, reaching for it with both hands. Every time he touched it, the light pulled away. Then he heard a voice, not angry, not loud. Just final. You touched my glory with unclean hands. He woke up shaking. Days later he saw it again, Chris. Not as the broken boy he had reduced to confession, but whole, radiant, standing among people crying for help, while the prophet himself stood on a stage shouting with no one listening. In the vision, the crowds turned away from him, not in anger but in disappointment. And that hurt more. Outside his dreams, the world kept moving. People still spoke Chris's name, whispered it in hospital hallways, typed it under old videos, prayed it over the sick like a secret. If only he were here. God used him. He was real. Chris was gone. But his impact multiplied. The prophet noticed something worse than loss of power, loss of trust. People looked at him differently now. They listened, but they no longer leaned forward. His words landed, but they did not stay. He had the title. He had the platform. But heaven had stepped back. And God, in his most severe mercy, left him alive to feel it. This was the punishment. Not death. Not disgrace. But a lifetime of speaking about a God who no longer answered him. They stopped arguing about Chris after a while. Not because the questions were answered, but because his absence became louder than explanation. Hospitals still remembered him. Nurses spoke his name in low voices during night shifts, pointing to empty chairs where he once sat with shaking hands and steady eyes. The blind mother never missed a Sunday. She brought her son, now laughing too loudly, hearing too much, and when people asked why she cried during worship, she only said, "I saw God pass by once." No statue was built for Chris. No official apology ever came. But grace has a way of surviving without permission. In poor neighborhoods, people prayed differently now, less polished, more honest. They stopped asking God to make them clean enough and started asking him to stay close enough. Broken men lifted their hands without rehearsing shame. Women with pasts walked into churches without lowering their eyes. They remembered the way Chris prayed. Simple. Unafraid. Like someone who knew God wasn't impressed by perfection. The prophet was still alive. Still preaching. Still dressed well. Still invited to speak. But when he closed his eyes now, heaven stayed quiet. And in that silence he finally understood. God had not left because of sin. God had left because of envy. Because he will not share his glory with fear disguised as holiness. Chris never came back. But his life became a question no one could ignore. What if God is closest to the ones we're quickest to condemn? Years later, a young woman walked into a hospital alone, pregnant, scared, shaking. This time a nurse ran to her. Doors opened. Hands reached out. Somewhere in the unseen something smiled. Grace had learned how to move without permission. And America, bruised but still breathing, carried the echo of a truth it almost buried. God does not choose the perfect. He chooses the available. He chooses the broken. And he never takes his gift back. Only the platforms that misuse it. The silence remained. But it was no longer empty. It was full of meaning. Thank you for being here. If you felt this, please like, share, and subscribe. Stay with us.